History as it happens, September 12, 2024. 1967 and the West Bank today.
War in the Middle East. Israeli forces drive spearheads across the Sinai Peninsula.
Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol must be the proudest man in the world, especially when he entered into the Jordanian sector of Jerusalem.
What's going to happen to all the Arabs here?
They'll have all freedom like the Arabs that they have in Israel.
They have to stop all this nonsense of the riots, of throwing stones, of wounding people. It's useless.
After 14 days of intensive negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, I have concluded with regret that they will not be able to reach an agreement at this time.
Yet Israel has been systematically consolidating the occupation.
More than a half century after occupying the West Bank, Israeli tanks are on the move again, in the biggest military operation in the territory since the Second Intifada a quarter century ago. The world's eyes have been transfixed on Gaza. The situation in the West Bank is dire too, as extremist settlers kill Palestinians and destroy their homes. What is the nature of the occupation? How does it function 57 years on? That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
And the White House says it's deeply disturbed by news that an American-Turkish woman has been shot dead, apparently by Israeli troops in the West Bank.
Miles away in the West Bank, Palestinians are facing threats from Israeli settlers who seek to push them out.
And so the occupying regime, the colonial regime, must sustain itself through violence, constant violence, in order to repress that population. It's been happening for over half a century. But Israel's most recent incursion is connected to a number of things. First of all, it's not new. It's actually just an escalation, a surge in a longer-running campaign into the cities and refugee camps of the northern West Bank.
The sudden swiftness of the Israeli army crushed UAR forces with a combined air and ground 1-2 punch. Egypt's charges that U.S. and British...
In 1967, 19 years after its founding, Israel became an occupying power.
Hero today of the Jewish peoples, General Moshe Dayan, defense minister and architect of the swiftest, most overwhelming victory of all time.
Its stunning victory in the Six-Day War over multiple Arab militaries left Israel in control of Sinai, the Golan Heights, Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. In this BBC Panorama program, a reporter caught up to Israeli soldiers who were seeing the Western Wall in the Old City for the first time.
What will happen if, by any chance, by later agreement, you have to move out?
Never.
You're not going to move out?
No, I was born here.
I think it's one of the greatest things we ever done.
1 minute, come on.
I was born 5 minutes from here, from the old city, and this was my dream for 20 years to see this place. And I think we will not give it back, never. It will be international for all the religions in the world, for all the people in the world, I think. This must be a holy place for all the people in the world.
What's going to happen to all the Arabs here?
They'll have all freedom like the Arabs that they have in Israel.
What do you mean is, do you think that Jerusalem is going to eventually be an international city or what?
We hope so, that it will be international for the Jews, Arabs, and Christians.
What, a city like Berlin?
Yeah. Well, I don't think of Berlin, not like Berlin, no. But I'm sure that the UN will keep these holy places for all the faiths in the world.
Was one of the reasons that you came here was that you fought for this wall, was it?
That's right. Yes. Yeah. We fought and we lost
we think
best
about
of our boys here.
So long time. We think about this wall a long time.
2,000 years we are dreaming for this. This is our dream.
57 years later, the United Nations top court says Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories violates international law. The ICJ says Israel should stop settlement activity in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem and end its illegal occupation of those areas in the Gaza Strip as soon as possible. Here's Jordan's Foreign Minister Ayman Safadi after the decision.
The occupation is unlawful. It is inhumane. It must end. Yet Israel has been systematically consolidating the occupation. It is blatantly denying Palestinians' right to self-determination. Its illegal unilateral measures are creating new facts on the ground that are killing all prospects for peace. Settlements, illegal under international law, are growing in numbers and are spreading farther in occupied Palestinian land.
Richard Visek was the attorney representing the United States position in this case. He disagreed with the idea that Israel should end its occupation right away.
A few days ago at the Munich Security Conference, Secretary Blinken emphasized that it is more urgent than ever to proceed to a Palestinian state, one that also ensures the security of Israel and makes the necessary commitments to do so. In light of these considerations, the court should not find that Israel is legally obligated to immediately and unconditionally withdraw from occupied territory. The court can address the questions before it within the established framework based on the Land for Peace principle and within the parameters of established principles of occupation law.
Now, the court's opinion is advisory, not legally binding, but it is the first time the court offered a position on the legality of the occupation. Palestinians, Israeli human rights activists, and many other observers have been saying this for decades. And legal or not, the occupation is repressive. Within 20 years, it provoked the first Palestinian uprising, or intifada, in 1987. In this episode, we're going to discuss the nature of the occupation on the West Bank and how it has changed over the decades. The current outbreak of violence is receiving some attention now amid the ongoing war in Gaza. In the West Bank, Jewish settlers who embrace a radical religious outlook are rampaging through Palestinian communities. And the IDF has mounted its largest military operation aimed at rooting out terrorists since Operation Defensive Shield, which took place during the bloodiest days of the Second Intifada in 2002. As Ian Black writes in his excellent book, Enemies and Neighbors, in early March of that year, a lone Palestinian sniper managed to kill 10 Israeli soldiers and settlers at a checkpoint near Ofra, outside Ramallah, hiding under an olive tree and firing an old rifle for 25 minutes. By March 7, 2002, the death toll since the uprising began was 1,068 Palestinians and 319 Israelis. On March 8th alone, writes Black, 40 Palestinians were killed by the IDF. The next day's suicide bombing of a popular West Jerusalem cafe across the road from the Prime Minister's residence on Balfour Street prompted bleak reflections about the end of normality for Israelis, including die-hard peaceniks who loathed Sharon and were horrified by his policies. And an appalling month culminated on the 27th when a Hamas bomber killed 29 elderly Israelis who were celebrating the Passover festival in a Netanya hotel. The Netanya bombing was the trigger for the long-prepared Operation Defensive Shield, writes Black, the biggest Israeli operation in the West Bank since 1967. And again, that is Ian Black in his excellent book, Enemies and Neighbors. 1967, 1987, 2002, 2024. Across the decades, Israel has ruled the West Bank, crushing Palestinian resistance and planting settlers on Palestinian land, and setting up separate legal systems, one for Jews, the other for Arabs. Since the Hamas terrorist attack on October 7th, almost a year ago already, I have produced dozens of episodes looking at different aspects of the origins of this conflict. And I'll share links to some related episodes in my weekly newsletter about the history of the two Palestinian uprisings and the failure of the Oslo peace process. Subjects I expect to touch on with Omar Rahman in this episode, but you can sign up for my newsletter at historyasithappens.com or search for History As It Happens on Substack. Omar Rahman is a fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, where he focuses on Palestine, Middle East geopolitics, and American foreign policy in the region. He is the editor of Akfar, the Council's online publication. And Omar joined me earlier this year to discuss the legacy of Yasser Arafat, who died 20 years ago. Welcome back to the show.
Glad to be here with you, Martin.
Welcome back.
Since first coming on the show, I've become a regular listener, so happy to be back on the program.
So you're a guest and a listener. Okay, you get bonus points for that. Yes. Welcome back. The first time you were on, we were discussing a related subject, the legacy of Yasser Arafat in the context of the ongoing war. So now we're going to talk about the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority that is now run by Mahmoud Abbas, who is Arafat's successor. But first, not everyone listens to every episode. Your past experience is relevant here. You used to be a journalist and you covered events in the West Bank for quite a bit. Tell us a little bit about that.
Between 2009 and 2012, I was based in the West Bank, working as a freelance journalist. And it was a very informative experience. I mean, I'm half Palestinian. I grew up visiting the West Bank, family in the West Bank, most summers growing up. So I had a lot of experience, dating back to the early 80s, before Oslo and all of that, and then after Oslo. But working there as a journalist, really engrossing myself in the nature of the occupation and the nature of the political reality there, was really eye-opening and informed my experience. And it's something, that in some ways it's very straightforward. In some ways it's very complex and layered. And so that type of experience, I think, is important if you want to inform people.
In preparing for our conversation here, I was exposed to some of these complexities, which I don't think most Americans are really aware of, exactly what is going on in the West Bank and the structure in the West Bank of a military occupation and how that has changed for the worse, really, since 1967. What do you make of the Israeli military operation in the West Bank? What spurred this, in your view?
Well, I just said, some things are complex and some things are straightforward. I think it's helpful to start with a very basic framing of the overall situation, because if you try to pinpoint, what's happening at any given moment and saying, well, this operation started because of this, or this retaliation started because of that, it's a chicken and egg scenario. It's useless. It's misleading. In its very basic framing, Israel is a military occupying power, and it has occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip for 56 years now and counting. In another sense, it's also a colonial power. It has moved its population into occupied territory from the very start of that occupation. And when you start building settlements, what comes with that is land confiscation, is resource confiscation and pillaging, and is the protection of the civilian population you're putting into occupied territory, which comes with repression. And any people, it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're American or Palestinian or Chinese or whatever, you're going to resist that type of encroachment on your land and livelihood. And so the occupying regime, the colonial regime, must sustain itself through violence, constant violence, in order to repress that population. It's been happening for over half a century. Obviously, I don't want to speak here just in abstract general terms. But Israel's most recent incursion is connected to a number of things. First of all, it's not new. It's actually just an escalation, a surge in a longer running campaign into the cities and refugee camps of the northern West Bank since really like May 2021, this particular campaign started. And that is, as a result of civil strife and turmoil and uprising that happened at that time. But each year since May 2021 has been the deadliest on record for Palestinians in the West Bank. 2021, 2022, 2023, and now 2024. And settler violence is the highest on record. And this particular Israeli government is committed in word and deed to the program of annexation. It's in a coalition agreement, the legislation it's passed. And so it's really going into these territories to neutralize the resistance, the pockets of resistance, through the overwhelming use of force and through the collective punishment on the local Palestinian population. It's forcibly displacing communities, and it's using also the situation in Gaza as a distraction, I think, to advance that annexationist agenda, to take major leaps in the West Bank while all the international community's attention is elsewhere. And one last thing, it's also connected to Gaza in other ways, I think, what's happening now. One, again, is proactively rooting out anyone who might want to attack Israel for what's happening in Gaza. And it's another arena for escalation, for prolonging and expanding the war in order to avoid, the political reckoning. So Israel's been doing that regionally, and it's using the West Bank for that as well.
Yeah, the stated purpose of this escalation is counterterrorism. Hamas does operate in the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority, no one really believes it's in charge there. The Israeli military rules there. So just tell us which Palestinian groups are operating there that Israel is concerned about from a security standpoint.
Well, all the groups that have been there historically in all the Palestinian territories are there in the West Bank. How powerful they are, how many people they have, kind of ebbs and flows. But really the phenomenon we've seen over the past few years, since that May 2021 experience I'm talking about, is really people that are armed and fighting are very loosely affiliated with any of these groups. Really, they're all kind of independents and very young people that have gathered together often to, either defend the refugee camps or to attack Israelis, as a form of retribution or pressure or any of those type of things. I mean, there was the Lion's Den in Nablus, which is a group that no one had ever heard of, kind of popped up, and the Jenin Brigades, and all these groups that are kind of brand new. They're not really affiliated with the kind of legacy organizations like Hamas and Fatah.
Based on your answer there, it doesn't sound like the Palestinian groups are all that well organized or powerful. Are you concerned, though, that another intifada might occur? Because Palestinians are clearly fed up and they don't really have legal recourse.
I would say, first of all, what is an intifada? We like to, in the West, throw around that term or apply it or try to anticipate, what is and what is not an intifada. An intifada historically has been, a large scale and sustained uprising against the occupation. But there were very stark differences between the first intifada in the late 80s and early 1990s and the second intifada in the 2000s, in the early 2000s. One was a mass movement of people, largely nonviolent, strikes, boycotts, protests, that kind of thing. And the other kind of devolved into an armed resistance by militant groups. And by its very nature then was not a mass movement because not everybody can participate in the use of arms. The time in between the first intifada and the second, the situation on the ground changed profoundly. With the Oslo Accords and everything else.
Behind the Israeli-Palestinian conflict lie the most profound questions about beliefs, political identity, collective fate. Etched in each side's mind are intense fears and emotions and a deep-seated commitment to defend their people's interests. There are no easy answers and certainly no painless ones, and therefore there is clearly no guarantee of success.
And the time since the second intifada until now, the situation on the ground has also changed. Israel has spent the past 20 years, and this was the experience I had as a journalist, seeing this, really transforming the ground to prevent another type of intifada from happening. So I don't really know what another intifada will look like or whether it's already happening and we just don't recognize it for what it is. Even when I was there in 2009 and 2012, there was, the AI revolution hadn't happened, but Israel is weaponizing that in the occupied territory. So your ability to wage a large scale uprising across a geographic space has changed completely.
Yeah, there are 750,000 Jewish settlers now in the West Bank, with more to come, and the Israeli military is all-powerful. What is the role of the Palestinian Authority in all of this?
The Palestinian Authority is pretty powerless in practice and according to the rules of the game, the Oslo Accords. It has no authority to police Israeli citizens, so Israeli settlers, or confront Israeli soldiers. According to international law, Israel is the one that is supposed to be, looking out for the welfare of the occupied population. At the same time, Israel is loyal to its own citizens, the settlers there, and who are not actually supposed to be there. So it has these kind of conflicting obligations, responsibilities in the territory. And the result is there's nobody protecting the Palestinian civilian population. And so it is extremely vulnerable. The Palestinian Authority can't protect it, and the Israeli military is not protecting it. In fact, it is trampling all over its rights and everything else. And so I think this is, why some people pick up guns to defend against that relentless encroachment by the Israelis. And that takes different forms, some agreeable, some not. But something else with the PA, the PA has lost its raison d'etre, its reason for being, and its legitimacy among its own public. And all that it has left is the role as the middleman of the occupation, administering and policing the Palestinian population centers on Israel's behalf while Israel continues to consolidate its hold over the occupied territories. And so its leadership has just become increasingly corrupt and authoritarian because those are the benefits it actually reaps from that role it's playing while it's not being held accountable by its own population.
Yeah. And we're going to dive into the history, but one more question. Why do the settlers have so much power? Because this problem does go back decades. The New York Times did a major piece in May about how the settler movement has been acting with impunity, not just recently, but again for decades. But now the leaders of the settler movement are in the governing coalition itself. They're not on the outside anymore.
Well, they haven't been on the outside for a long time. I mean, there's been ministers in governments, all these right-wing governments that are settlers. But the settlers have power and impunity not because they're settlers. They have that because they're Jewish Israelis. Palestinians have no rights because they're not.
Because there's two different legal systems, right, in the West Bank.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And this is the overarching system of power and relations between these two peoples. And so while for decades, Israel tried to establish kind of a veneer of law and order, settler impunity has just been continually reinforced for decades. And that has kind of radicalized the settler movement. Its ideology isn't in itself radical, this kind of religious Zionism. They believe themselves the lords of the land, that it belongs to them, that they can do whatever they want. And in that process, over 56 years of occupation and a much longer period dating back to 1948 and even the Mandate period, Palestinians are just routinely dehumanized to the point that what we're seeing in Gaza is happening, where, a Palestinian life is absolutely worthless and meaningless. But in the occupied West Bank, it's the same. And so these people that believe themselves the lords of the land, and they've acted with impunity for decades, can just do whatever they want. Yeah. That's how they feel.
But there are rules, there are laws. It's military rule, military laws, not civilian laws. That's supposed to govern both Jews and Arabs in the West Bank. But an example, maybe you can touch on this, and then again, we will get to the history here, just to give people an idea of how this works. I was reading about a settler outpost that was illegal but was allowed to stay, bulldozing a Palestinian village. Israeli human rights groups tried to take it to court representing Palestinians, but it went nowhere.
Well, first of all, just a small correction.
Sure.
The Israeli settlers, the Jewish settlers living in the occupied West Bank, are not living under military law.
Okay.
The West Bank itself technically is under occupation and occupation law and military law, but the civilian population that Israel has transferred there is under Israeli civilian law.
Okay.
So they're not tried in the military courts in the same way.
And is that a new development?
It's been in place since the occupation started. Literally within weeks, that differentiation was made.
Right.
At the same time, yes, you see stuff like that happening. Basically, all settlements, first of all, are legal under international law. Now, Israel differentiates between these settler outposts, which were not permitted, and those settler settlements that were, in terms of what it considers illegal. But none of that really matters, because nothing is enforced. Even when somebody's killed, somebody might be held for like a month in prison and then released. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, there was one recent situation where a Jewish settler shot a Palestinian in the stomach. The Israeli military was right there watching it. They questioned the guy for about an hour and then let him go. A lot of this violence, people don't understand, is happening as Israeli military or police forces that are there ostensibly to protect people or prevent violence from getting worse. It's happening while they're simply watching and not doing anything about it. So before June 1967, who controlled the West Bank and who lived there?
Well, how far would you want to go back?
Well, we could go back centuries. Well, I tend to try to start these conversations with a frame of reference. Balfour Declaration, British Mandate, 1948. Let's say in May of 1967, who was controlling the West Bank and who lived there? Because the June 67 Six-Day War, Israel becomes the occupier.
So basically, during the War of 1948, Jordan took control of the West Bank. There's an interesting story behind that. I think, I would recommend your listeners maybe read Avi Shlaim, the great Israeli-British historian. He wrote a book in the late 80s called Collusion Across the Jordan. And it's about how the Emir of Transjordan at the time, Abdullah I, who was installed by the British, secretly conspired with the leaders of the Zionist movement to carve up the British mandate of Palestine between them. Anyway, so during the War of 1948, based on that agreement between the two sides, he invaded the West Bank and took control of the West Bank. And the only place that I think the Zionist forces and the Arab Legion of Jordan fought was in Jerusalem, which wasn't really supposed to be part of the Jewish state that was in the UN partition plan. It was firmly located within the West Bank, but as a corpus separatum that was going to be internationally administered.
International condominium was the term used, but go ahead. Yeah,
exactly. Jordan took control of East Jerusalem, and the new state of Israel took control of West Jerusalem. So anyway, Jordan took control of the West Bank, and it annexed it in 1950, and it gave citizenship to the Palestinian population that was living there. So that's who lived in the West Bank at that time. And then Abdullah was assassinated in 1951 in Jerusalem for, suspicions that he had collaborated with the Israelis.
Okay. So the June War, let's briefly discuss the origins of it and its outcome, and why Israel decided to occupy these territories, not just the West Bank, Gaza, Sinai, Golan Heights, East Jerusalem. What prompted the war?
This particular war is shrouded in a lot of mythology, I think, more than maybe any other war.
Because it was a preemptive strike.
Yes. There was a lot of military and political posturing on all sides happening at the time. So it allowed for, I think, a wider interpretation of events and spinning of events. But over the years, the historical studies and testimony revealed that Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, wasn't really interested in war because he knew his army was still far outmatched by Israel. And so on June 5th, Israel preemptively struck Egypt and basically wiped out its entire air force while it was still on the ground. And then with lightning speed, incredible, it seized the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the West Bank from Jordan. More important for this conversation, it's worth noting that Israeli institutions, including the military, the intelligence services, the Shin Bet, and other institutions began preparing for the occupation years ahead of time, which should tell you something. The military established kind of a legal and administrative apparatus, and Meir Shamgar, I think his name is, was instrumental in that. He became, Israel's Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The Shin Bet drew up action plans and trained its officers for establishing their role in a military government. And we shouldn't forget that for 19 years, between 1949 and 1966, Israel had a military government inside of its own territory for the Arab citizens that remained. They lived under a military regime. Even though they were given citizenship ultimately, they still lived under a military rule. And actually, Israel disbanded that finally 6 months before the war. I don't know if that is another sign or a dot to connect, but
interesting.
Something to consider.
Because we were discussing the settlers today, we should have probably talked a little bit about what's motivating them. It's not all religion. It's not all ideology. That's a large part of it, but not all the settlers are going there for that reason. Was Israel eyeing the West Bank, as you put it, prior to the June War because, say, some Israelis viewed the West Bank as biblical Israel? So we're talking about religious or ideological concerns versus, say, security concerns, keeping the Israeli army on the West Bank of the Jordan River for security reasons.
I think both of those streams of thought were present and motivating. The religious stream, especially in the early days of Israel, wasn't that strong. It was always present, always considered. But the people that established the state of Israel and who held power within Israel were secular. I think they used that religious component, and even very early on, I think referred to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria to kind of draw that connection. Yeah. But the labor government in particular largely viewed the occupied territories more strategically. They viewed land as obviously very useful in terms of expansion. You need land to settle your population and grow. Also, the main water aquifers in the land from the river to the sea, I think 80% of the mountain water aquifers are in the West Bank and only 20% in Israel. And this is a crucial resource, very important. And so taking specific land, in fact, if you look at the strategic placement of settlements early on by that labor government, it corresponds with where, access to these water aquifers are. So that was very important. But, there are two very specific figures or very kind of towering figures within the labor movement who set the tone. There's Yigal Allon and Moshe Dayan, who was the Minister of Defense. And they both had two separate plans. Yigal Allon he wanted to carve out a bunch of territory for Israel to take and then to kind of negotiate the rest back to Jordan. The rest back being the parts most populated by Palestinians, because driving everything is an expansion of land, but without the people. Because when Israel took control of the land in 1967, it took control over 1 million people. And so it didn't want those people. It couldn't absorb them into the state without really disrupting its own demographic balance. And so, it sought to take as much land as possible with as little people as possible.
Because there's obviously a very human aspect to this story. Reading from William Cleveland's book, A History of the Modern Middle East, although the war lasted only 6 days, it created another tragic Arab refugee situation and a complex demographic dilemma for Israel. Jordan, in surrendering the West Bank, lost a large portion of its settled Palestinian population, but at the same time received 300,000 new refugees fleeing the West Bank and Gaza Strip. In Syria, about 80,000 inhabitants were uprooted from the Golan Heights, and in Egypt, the continued fighting along the Suez Canal reduced the cities of the Canal Zone to ruins. Later on in his study, Cleveland says, in 67, the West Bank comprised 2,270 square miles, inhabited by an estimated 600,000 Palestinian Arabs. Gaza Strip, 350,000 Palestinians in 140 square miles in size, the vast majority of them in Gaza, refugees. So there must have been a debate in Israel about whether this was a good idea, given the human aspect of it, the human dimension.
There was a little bit of debate, but I think there was a strong desire for territory and for resources. And you can see, I mean, there was a lot of criticism even of the government, the first government that was established after the war in 1948, for not using the power at its disposal to take the entire territory, for stopping short of that. And so I think there was a lot of debate in that interim period for taking more territory. I think Israel actually also looked at the territories very differently between the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, and the occupied West Bank in particular. And it saw its future as holding on to the occupied West Bank, or at least a large chunk of it, indefinitely. Whereas the others, it was willing to barter those back to the corresponding states, so the Sinai for Egypt. Yeah. There was debate over that, whether to barter those back for peace or not within Israel. But those were ultimately seen by that early government as bargaining chips.
And the West Bank has always been the prize, so to speak, because of its historical or biblical significance to a portion of Israel's population.
Yes, but listen, something very important to understand. Like in 1948, Israel, forcibly expelled roughly 750,000 Palestinians from the area, became a state, or those people fled and were not allowed to return.
Yes. Yeah, Ian Lustig, sorry to interrupt, Omar. Ian Lustig has made this point on the show. The fact that there were refugees from the 48 war, and that happens in every war, he says the problem here is that they were not allowed back.
That's right. Exactly. So it's the same outcome in the end, no matter how they were made into refugees.
Yeah. Not that being expelled is a pleasant experience, but you get my point. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But the point being that the Palestinian population that remained within Israel in those first borders was still substantial. It was like roughly 17% of the population, but manageable. Israel could absorb that Palestinian population and still pursue its reason for being as it saw it without too much complication. In 1967, as you mentioned, 300,000 or so Palestinians were driven out of the occupied territories, mostly from the Jordan Valley and around Jerusalem, and pushed into Jordan. But the population that remained, again, it was around 1 million people. And so it couldn't absorb those people. So what did it do? Again, it still wants the land on which those people sit. It just doesn't want the population. The prime minister at the time, Levi Eshkol, famously said, he was speaking to Golda Meir and said, you like the dowry, but you don't like the bride. You like the land, but you don't like the population that sits on it. And so Israel put in place a military government to manage those people while it worked on taking the land out from underneath them.
And that tension exists to this moment. Unresolved, the issue of Palestinian autonomy, Palestinian statelessness, and the nature of Israeli democracy, and why critics of the occupation say that Israel cannot be called a true democracy, given the way it has handled this problem since 1967. Cleveland writes here, the tensions between peace activists and settlers, between secularists and advocates of the need to introduce a greater measure of religious law, were sharpened rather than lessened as Israel entered the fourth decade of its existence as an independent state, referring to the aftermath now of the Six-Day War in 1967, because a big turning point here, Omar, is 1977, because the first decade of the occupation, there was settlement, right? There was Israeli or Jewish settlement of the West Bank. But 1977, it really takes off, or it takes on a more highly charged tone of religious militancy with the rise of Menachem Begin as prime minister. Why don't you pick it up from there?
Sure. I mean, the 1967 war really unleashed kind of a religious fervor within Israel and led to a huge expansion of the kind of religious Zionist movement. When Menachem Begin came to power in 1977, I think he seized upon that, took advantage of that. Because I think the first speech he actually gave was in a settlement. But I think the main difference in terms of policy toward the occupied territories between the Israeli right-wing views and those of the left that preceded it was that the kind of lens in which it viewed it was maybe less pragmatically important and more kind of intrinsically important as belonging to the Jewish people, and that it could not be handed back to anyone, be that Palestinians or be that Jordan, that Israel needed to control this territory indefinitely, that it belonged to them. And so, as you said, the settlement enterprise went into hyperdrive. Instead of the Alon plan I mentioned, in which they were kind of strategically placed in those areas he thought Israel should keep, the Likud government of Begin puts settlements throughout the occupied territories, and especially around Palestinian population centers, in order to break up their territorial and demographic continuity, and ultimately to prevent a Palestinian state from ever emerging there. And the man who drew up the settlement plan, I think he was the head of the World Zionist Organization's settlement division, Mattatyahu Drablus, he said, I want to quote him, there must not be the slightest doubt regarding our intention to hold the areas of Judea and Samaria forever. I think also, Begin imagined something similar to Moshe Dayan. I didn't get into Moshe Dayan's plan, but it was really to kind of hold all the territories indefinitely and to ultimately offer the Palestinians living there some type of self-rule or limited self-rule kind of under Israeli sovereignty. And he even presented that as part of the Camp David negotiations with Egypt. But in order to do that, you needed a local Palestinian population that was willing to come to terms with permanent Israeli rule and Palestinian self-rule or limited self-rule under that. And Israel was never able to do that. It tried early on, even under the Labor government, to kind of nurture a local leadership that would acquiesce and negotiate with Israel. And it just failed time again, because those people ended up lacking legitimacy. There was always much more support for the kind of nationalist element and for the PLO. And Begin, there was a very famous failed attempt with the so-called village leagues. They looked towards a leadership that was in the rural villages of the West Bank, as opposed to the main urban centers and the municipalities, which were kind of firmly controlled by nationalists. And this was another failed attempt. They armed them, they provided them resources, provided them influence over permits and licensing, which we haven't gotten into yet, but it was really essential to running the occupation. And still, that project failed.
Yeah, this is many years before there's anything called the Palestinian Authority. These are the years of the PLO and Fatah and Yasser Arafat, who at this point, they are dedicated to violent resistance and still trying to reclaim all of Israel. We discussed this a little bit in our first conversation, but I think it's important to bring it back here. What is the Palestinian stance at this point?
So in 1967, the PLO, which was established in 1964, was still under the kind of tutelage of the Arab states that had created it. And their intention was not to unleash Palestinian violent resistance, but to actually contain it.
That's right, because there would be retaliation by Israel into their territory.
Contain Palestinian nationalism that was flourishing, especially in the refugee camps located in these Arab states, and to contain armed resistance. There was groups outside of the PLO like Fatah, which were trying to kind of initiate some kind of armed struggle against Israel to recover. And again, these were coming out of the refugee camps to recover the lost homes and lands of the Palestinian refugees. Fatah ended up taking over the PLO after the Arab states' defeat in 1967. It wasn't until really 68 or 69 that Arafat and Fatah took over the PLO and tried to initiate that. But it, within a few years, especially after 1973, realized that was an impossible aim. And so from early on, from 73, 74, it kind of worked internally in order to convince its own constituency and public that there needed to be a kind of a negotiated settlement. And Arafat famously went in 1974 to the United Nations, and said, I come with a freedom fighter's gun and an olive branch. Don't let the olive branch fall from my hand. I want to negotiate, but if you're not going to work with me, then that's going to fall and I'll have to continue on armed struggle. That was kind of the euphemism.
The 67 defeat was so utterly humiliating for Nasser's cause of kind of like an Arab League. That is what kind of freed the Palestinian cause to become, well, autonomous. I don't know if that's the right word, but yeah, I mean, it allowed the PLO to establish itself and not just be kind of a token organization of the Arab countries, right?
No, that's right. I mean, I think the 67 defeat was instrumental in, liberating the Palestinian national movement and for the PLO and those within it to kind of gain agency over Palestinian decision making.
Thanks, Omar. Sometimes my questions, they're like mazes. I eventually get to the point. So military occupations aren't in and of themselves illegal. They've happened. They're supposed to be temporary. They're not supposed to make major changes to the occupied territory, and you're not supposed to trample over the rights of the people in the territory either. How did the international community respond to Israel's decision to occupy the West Bank and these other places after 67?
Well, there was an immediate resolution, 242, calling on Israel to return the occupied territories because you're not allowed to hold or conquer land by force and annex it. And so there was an immediate resolution, 242, and later 338, calling on Israel to leave the territories.
At the United Nations?
Yes.
Did the United States support those resolutions?
Yes. The United States supported those resolutions. At the same time, and you're talking about the illegality of occupation. Yes, occupation isn't in and of itself illegal, but Israel began doing things immediately that were illegal. It annexed Jerusalem within weeks of the war. Even the United States, as well as the rest of the international community, didn't recognize Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem and still doesn't today. The U.S. under Trump took a different direction. As you mentioned before, it displaced hundreds of thousands of people. That's illegal. It refused to recognize the applicability of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which outlines the laws of occupation. Within the first 3 months of occupation, the first settlement was built, which is illegal. Within 10 years, I think 20% or so of the land of the West Bank and Gaza was expropriated and 27 settlements were built. By the time Begin, who we just mentioned, took power, or by 1987, which is 20 years in, I think 40% of the occupied West Bank and Gaza had been expropriated and 125 illegal settlements had built. So you see the kind of nature and trajectory of this thing. It's expansionist in its agenda. It's trying to permanently alter the situation on the ground, and it's using policies forbidden under international law in order to do that. So I think that speaks to the kind of illegality. Also, by the way, just a few months ago, the International Court of Justice, the highest court in the world, ruled in an advisory opinion for the General Assembly that Israel's occupation is unlawful, that it needs to be removed as speedily as possible, and that reparations need to be paid for the Palestinian population.
So, Omar, we began by discussing the nature of the occupation today. What was it like in the early years?
I think in terms of the nature of the occupation, what was imposed was a direct military occupation that dominated every aspect of people's lives. First of all, the Palestinian people that came under that occupation obviously weren't granted Israeli citizenship, but a military government was imposed with a military governor who was essentially like a dictator. And there was a legal system that was imposed consisting of, the previous legal corpuses that existed prior to that. So Ottoman, British mandate emergency laws, Jordanian laws for the West Bank, Egyptian laws for the Gaza Strip. And that was all kind of supplemented or really dominated by a body of military orders and decrees from this military government. And so this kind of hodgepodge of legislation allowed Israel to use the law very selectively for its own ends. So one example of that is, let's say the end is to take territory. Well, there was an Ottoman law in place that said, if any land, any private property was laid fallow for 10 years, if it was unused by its owners, then it would revert back to state land. There was also a British mandate law that allowed the emergency government to seize private property as a security zone. And so Israel would say, okay, here, this property is now a security zone, and so the owners cannot access it. And then it would lay fallow there under that security zone for 10 years, and then it would revert to state land. And then Israel would build a settlement on it for its population. And so what recourse did the Palestinian owners have? Well, they could go try to get their land back through the Israeli courts because the Israeli Supreme Court allowed access actually for Palestinians in the occupied territories. And so they would go back, and then the military would say, well, these are the laws in place. And the court would agree with them. And so now you actually have this kind of semblance of due process that the Palestinians tried to get their land back through the court system and it didn't work. And so, under this veneer of legality and justice, it has been that Israel has kind of colonized the occupied territories for the last 56 years. In addition to that, all political activity was banned except for the municipal governments. Newspapers and books were censored. Palestinian national identity was essentially criminalized. Education curriculum was controlled by the military. Pretty much all work, all jobs ran through the military. So if you wanted to be a civil servant, a teacher, a postman, anything like that, you had to go through, the Israeli intelligence service in order to be cleared, right? And so if you were participating in protests, if you were politically active at all, sorry, you're not getting a job to support yourself and your family. Everything required permits and licenses. If you want to open a business, you need a permit. If you want to farm tomatoes, if you want to dig a well. So everything requires you to go to the Israeli military government. And that's how you control the population and its ability to resist or to do anything else. The economy, for example, the Palestinian economy is tightly controlled. Its markets are captive for Israeli products. No business that would come into competition with an Israeli company was allowed to exist. No industrial development was allowed to happen so that the population would be unskilled labor or cheap labor for Israel's economy. And so this is how Israel dominated the Palestinian population for those 10 years and well into the future. And we know that's not even getting into the military court system that separates between Palestinians who are non-citizens and have no basic rights and Israelis living on the same land with them, Israeli settlers who are living under Israeli civil law. So we see that kind of separation, and separation is really the key.
People who may be unfamiliar with the reality on the ground for Palestinians, what I'm trying to do with this episode is get people to think about what's happening there through a different lens. There's more to this than, say, Palestinian terrorism, Israeli military retaliation, and the cycle of violence.
Maybe I can draw an analogy for your listeners. Imagine if the Chinese invaded America, they conquered us and they set up a military government to administer and police us. And all political activity was banned. If you wanted to be a school teacher or a postal worker or an electrician, you need approval from their intelligence services. If you want a driver's license or a marriage license, you need to get approval from a Chinese military bureaucrat. If you want to open a business, if you want to dig a well, if you want to do anything, you need a permit from the military administration. If you want to travel abroad, you need a permit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And through this license and permit system, they're controlling our lives. And if you want to talk politics or display an American flag, a nationalist symbol, if you're not a docile, passive resident, sorry, no licenses for you, no permits for you. You can't do anything. If you're politically active or you protest against the regime, you end up in prison, possibly tortured or deported. And then one day, the Chinese citizens just start showing up, guarded by the military. They take your land. They set up communities. They go where they want to do and do what they want to do with impunity. They use our water resources to, fill their swimming pools while you don't have enough to wash your clothes or brush your teeth. Tell me what you're going to do. Tell me what you're going to do. That's the kind of fundamental reality that Palestinians lived in after 1967 in one way or another until today. That's the reality. So maybe that's not a perfect analogy, but it's something for understanding, the situation and why people are fighting back or have tried to fight back in one way or another.
The occupation policies provoke the first Intifada in 1987, and that is where Hamas comes from. We were talking about the early years here. There was no Hamas. There was no Islamic Jihad. They are a result of these things that we've been discussing. That doesn't justify their behavior, but we're trying to understand how and why people respond to situations the way they do. So the occupation policies did provoke the first Intifada in 1987. I spoke to Khalid El-Gindi about the first and second Intifada on this show. I'll make sure I put links to those episodes as well as our initial episode about Yasser Arafat, Omar, in my weekly newsletter as well. I spoke to Khalid, who I assume you know, Khalid El-Gindi, scholar.
Very well. Yep.
And we talked about the Oslo process as well on the show. Why don't we jump to that and how the West Bank was put into areas that exist to this day. Area A, Area B, Area C. Because we're trying to give people an idea of how this occupation, how it functions, what it looks like. Area A is Palestinian control, but that's a small part. Area B is joint control, right, between Israel and Palestinians. And Area C, which is the largest amount of land, is Israeli control. What is the purpose of still having these areas today?
Sure.
That was a lot there. Sorry, Omar.
As you're mentioning, what came after the Oslo Accords was a response by Israel and its occupation to the Intifada itself, which was, a 5-year uprising that significantly raised the costs on Israel for maintaining its occupation.
It made many Israelis aware of just what their country had been doing.
Yes, absolutely. And the international community, where there was a lack of awareness before, kind of the brutality and violence needed to sustain the occupation that I mentioned before was up front in everybody's faces for the first time. So there was tremendous pressure on Israel to change that. What resulted, though, unfortunately, the way the Oslo Accords were structured was really, not an end to the occupation, but a reorganization to Israel's occupation. It realized that the direct military occupation that had persisted for 25 years was untenable, unsustainable. But it didn't want to exit the land that it had come to control and place its settlements on for all the reasons that were previously mentioned. And so what it did was it reorganized its power and occupation by, in effect, getting the middleman it always sought that never had legitimacy before from the local population. Again, I said there was always support for the PLO and for the nationalists. Well, now we get this weakened PLO in there to do that job for it, to agree to that. And so the PLO comes in 1994, establishes the Palestinian Authority.
Which was supposed to be temporary, but yeah.
Exactly. It was supposed to last for a period of 5 years until the final status was negotiated, which never happened, or happened but failed. And there was no clause in there, exit clause in there for where to go once that failed.
Yeah.
Anyway, what happened was the Palestinian Authority was established and Israel's military occupation divested itself of the responsibilities of occupation, of administering and policing the population centers, which it handed over to the Palestinian Authority very quickly in urban centers. So what it did was it kind of carved up the West Bank and Gaza into three, or the West Bank for ABC. Gaza was a little bit different, and then it ceased to be the case after 2005. But in the West Bank into areas A, B, and C, which are various zones of jurisdiction. So in areas A, which I think comprises about 18% of the West Bank and is the most heavily populated areas, the Palestinian Authority has the responsibility for administering and policing and security there. In B, it has the responsibility for administering, but Israel has responsibility for security. And in C, Israel has both of those responsibilities. And C is 60% of the West Bank, so it's pretty much everything. And so Israel pulled out of the population centers, handed over those responsibilities. So the friction with the local population, the cost of administering and policing now went to the Palestinian Authority, which is funded by donor countries from the international community and Palestinian tax money. So Israel divested itself of the costs, divested itself of the responsibility, but did not divest itself of the control. And the thing you got to understand is, areas A and B, which collectively make up 40% of the West Bank, are not contiguous. They are enclaves, all of them. I think areas A are like 11 urban centers or enclaves, and areas B are like 130 or something to that effect. And each one of those enclaves is surrounded by area C. So it's like an archipelago of Palestinian enclaves or islands in a sea of Israeli control. And so everything still flows through that Israeli control mechanism, and it's able to enforce itself on the Palestinian population. So it's kind of like South African Bantustans. Now, under that circumstance, the PA, its control or its rule or its autonomy is really, fictitious. It's totally dependent on Israel. It just isn't direct anymore. It's more indirect rule that Israel has. And it doesn't even respect that. I mean, if you look at areas A, really, which is now Jenin, Nablus, Tulkarm, the places where the Israeli military incursions are happening today, those are areas A. So even, the Palestinians don't have security control in those territories. It's all a bit fictitious.
Is it possible to know what might have happened had Arafat accepted the deal in 2000 at Camp David?
I think it's impossible to say. It's
a counterfactual, counter-historical. In hindsight, it may have just been better to accept what is offered, even though at the time, there was a lot of pressure not to accept it.
Yeah. What was offered in 2000 was a very incomplete proposal. Now, it's nice to think about, you can fill in the gaps there and contemplate a reality that would have occurred. But at the same time, I'm not so sure it would have actually taken place.
And there's so many outstanding issues, like Jerusalem, for one.
And the settlers and the refugees. But one of the things that makes a two-state solution extremely difficult to imagine, if not impossible to achieve today, is something that also existed then. Now, not to the same degree, but to a large degree. And that is that there are hundreds of thousands of settlers in the occupied territories, and you have to remove those settlers, or a great portion of them, enough where it makes it very untenable. And those settlers have a ton of political power and influence within Israel. And it makes it extremely difficult to imagine rolling back the occupation, the settlement movements, and to establish a Palestinian state. It makes it virtually impossible today. And even then,
it's pretty clear to my eyes that this is a de facto annexation of the West Bank that's been underway for quite a while and is accelerating. You know, it's the avowed policy of the current Israeli government, at least some of the ministers in this coalition. There's even a Jewish Power Party, capital J, capital P, in Israel. If Israel decides to go ahead and fully, if not de jure, but de facto, annex the West Bank in its entirety, who would stop them? How would that be stopped? Because it's pretty clear that the current U.S. government isn't willing to use any leverage to try to change Israel's behavior.
It's a very good question, Martin, and it's one, people like myself think about every day. There is no power to stop them, but there is the power to hold them accountable, if possible. Now, the United States is likely going to stand in that way, but the outcome of the situation you described is one that exists in effect today, and in fact was just recognized by the ICJ in its ruling. And that's an apartheid reality. And that's something that is a huge violation of international law, and it's incumbent on members of the international community, states and institutions, to hold Israel accountable for that and to put and apply pressure in the same way it did to apartheid South Africa in the 70s and 80s, leading ultimately to the collapse of a racist regime that denies people their rights indefinitely based on their ethnicity or race. And that's the type of situation we have here today. So I think it's about rallying the international community to hold Israel accountable. Unfortunately, our own country stands on an island in support of that type of reality today. But I think among the public, those type of perceptions and willingness to treat Israel or to recognize that reality is changing pretty dramatically.
You know, because for a long time, as a distant observer here, not an expert like yourself, I assumed that the occupation would ultimately become unsustainable. The costs are too high to Israel, to the Palestinians. There is still the issue of many, many Palestinian people who live on the West Bank, right? They just simply can't be driven into neighboring countries. But maybe I was wrong that the occupation has proven to be sustainable, although very, very costly.
It's been sustainable longer than anybody else could have imagined. There's reasons for things that uphold that. And part of it is the inability or the difficulty in holding Israel accountable. Hopefully that changes. But, the last 11 months have been very despairing in that sense, seeing what's taking place and the inability to stop it, which is, apartheid, as bad as it is nothing compared to genocide or to the destruction of a society in its home. It's something that we're witnessing in the Gaza Strip. That's been, incredibly difficult to watch and difficult to see your country's government support, unfortunately. And so,
you're talking about the United States.
Yes, exactly. My country.
Because my last episode was with Dalia Shenlin, and we were talking about this from the perspective of Israelis. How there's not a lot of support for Netanyahu, but that should not be mistaken with support for a two-state solution, which has dropped dramatically on both sides of the divide.
Perceptions on both sides have changed with the reality and what people perceive as possible. And then also the kind of level of hatred and distrust that's arisen between the two sides. I've worked with Dalia actually on a book chapter about public opinion on both sides relating to possible end scenarios like two states and one state. And her and I have both written about confederation as a possibility. But in the current light of day, everything seems very difficult to imagine, any kind of brighter day type of solution seems clouded over by this kind of dark reality that we're currently living in.
Yeah, because the Gaza Strip is dealing with physical destruction, just the sheer physical destruction of homes, schools, hospitals, etc. Who's going to rebuild all of that? And then, of course, we've been discussing the West Bank. Where would a Palestinian state even be today when you consider what the facts on the ground, as Netanyahu has often referred to them?
Yeah, I think the Gaza Strip has been made unlivable with purpose. All civilian infrastructure and homes and everything else destroyed so that people can't live there. I think that's the kind of purpose, the underlying purpose of this military campaign. But yes, in that context with Gaza and also with the West Bank, as I mentioned previously, it's hard to imagine a Palestinian state coming into existence under this scenario unless the kind of political dynamics change. And there's a way to change the political dynamics. Nothing's impossible, but it's about political pressure, mobilizing political pressure and accountability for this type of reality until the sides can agree to something that's much more sustainable, just, moral, and everything else you can imagine.
Last remark here. What you're saying reminds me of something Jean-Pierre Filiu, the historian, said to me when I talked to him some months ago. Going back to the very beginning of the State of Israel, David Ben-Gurion and others recognized that there would never be peace as long as the Palestinian issue was unresolved. And they made some efforts, of course they didn't work, they ultimately failed, to try to resolve that problem. For instance, by resettling some Palestinians back into the State of Israel. They never went anywhere. Even Ariel Sharon floated this idea for a short period of time. It didn't go anywhere. So here we are today, 2024, and we're talking about the same thing that David Ben-Gurion was talking about in 1948 and beyond.
It's amazing how things don't change in that sense. You touched on something very important before in terms of how things don't change. At the end of the day, despite these 56 years of occupation and settlement and everything else, at the end of the day, Palestinian population there remains. And that is the source of the challenge, of the dilemma, and the problems, and the tensions, and the violence, and everything else. Because Israel has been unable to resolve that fundamental dilemma in terms of the population and the land, and to separate the two from each other. Now, the reality it's imposed on the ground as a result of that dilemma is dystopian if you're there to witness it yourself. It truly is. There's a wonderful book, one that I read when I was a journalist there, by an Israeli architectural theorist named Eyal Weizman. It's called Hollow Land, and I recommend it to anybody. But it really opened my eyes in terms of how Israel was re-engineering the physical space to resolve that dilemma for itself. And the way I describe it in my writings is that basically it's superimposed two spatial grids on top of each other so that these two populations can kind of live in two separate topographies. They can live in the same geography without ever meeting on the same topography. That Israel controls this one infrastructural grid on top with settlements and infrastructure and roads and everything else, and the Palestinians exist on another one, and that one dominates the other in physical space over time. And so that's what Israel has created, so that its infrastructure and its people that are in the occupied territories are seamlessly linked into the rest of the state. And the Palestinians are crushed underneath it within this own dominated space.
I think for there to be peace, the Palestinians will have to accept some basic reality. The first is that while Israel is prepared to make generous compromises for peace, it cannot go back to the 1967 lines, because these lines are indefensible, because they don't take into account certain changes that have taken place on the ground, demographic changes that have taken place over the last 44 years.
Benjamin Netanyahu speaking to President Obama in the Oval Office in 2011. Demographic changes, in other words, Israeli settlements. On the next episode of History as It Happens, what was the Biden Doctrine?
To those asking for a third decade of war in Afghanistan, I ask, what is the vital national interest?
Every president wants to put his stamp on U.S. foreign policy. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.